Can you explain how we are conditioned and what that means? Well, we're conditioned in so many ways. Really what conditioning means is that who I am changes based on what I believe is expected of me. Now, some of this is just really very harmless socialization. So over breakfast, Key and I were talking about the fact that the chila, which is that very sweet, nice, soft yellow thing made from basin flour that we had for breakfast, tastes so much better when you eat it with your fingers than when you try to cut it with your fork and knife and stuff. And in a place like India, you can eat it with your fingers. You're supposed to eat it with your fingers. And there's something that is very special about the digestion of food that begins with the touch of your fingers that you don't get when it's fork and knife and spoon. But in much of the world, you don't have that luxury because it is important to not have your table manners be something that are so affronting to the people you're sharing a table with that becomes the topic. You know, you want to be able to create space in whatever situations we're in for really that which is important to emerge. And if eating with your fingers is something that's so disturbing or distracting or unusual to your table partners, this is where we learn to have table manners and use forks and knives. But in India, we eat with our fingers. So one level of conditioning is the stuff that's really pretty harmless. I mean, my sense of self is not encroached upon by having to use a fork and a knife when I am eating in places where that's what people expect of you. I don't feel any more my true self when I'm able to eat with my hands than when I'm not. Sure, I enjoy it more, but it's not an encroachment upon myself if I have to abide by certain rules. I prefer to go barefoot, but there's a lot of places in the world where you can't go barefoot. I've shown up at airports and have them say to me, "Excuse me, ma'am, I'm so sorry. We will not allow you to board without a pair of shoes." And you end up having to buy one at an airport store. That's the harmless type of conditioning. It's the type that may be not our first choice, it may be not my preference, but it's pretty harmless, it's mostly innocuous, it's not encroaching on who I am. Then there's the stuff that really does. Then there's the conditioning that most of us go through that is, every time you look in a mirror, you reassess how you feel about yourself. So really what looking in a mirror should do is simply assist us in making sure that we don't have food caught between our teeth, let's say, that we don't have a pen mark running across our face. But most of us use mirrors for something much, much deeper than just to make sure that I've got the food out of my teeth. Who I am and how I feel about myself gets determined and shifted and adjusted and readjusted every time I look in the mirror. Every time I get on a scale. Every time I look around at other people and compare myself to them, who I am readjusts. And this is conditioning. We don't come into the world with this. Children's perception of themselves is not readjusted based on you. And in many ways, that's actually what is so compelling about children. Why is it that we're drawn to smile and to make faces and to, clap with kids who we don't even know? Their presence, their unconditioned presence, creates space for us for a moment to live an unconditioned life. Children are not looking at us as someone who is rich or poor, someone who's old or young, someone who's beautiful or not beautiful, someone who is gay or straight, or socially acceptable or not socially acceptable, or a success or not a success. And their lack of conditioning permits us for a moment to step back into an unconditioned place within ourselves. It's like we were talking last night about looking at people as body versus looking at people as soul. It's not just from my perspective, it's that I've then created a space into which that person can step into it as soul. So conditioning happens in many ways, in many places. It begins in our families. We pick up what's important to our parents. So if every time our mother looked in the mirror, she said, "Oh my God, I can't believe it, I'm so fat, I'm so ugly," and every conversation we heard was her saying to our dad, "Oh, this dress makes me look so fat, oh my God, I can't eat this, I've got to lose weight." Well, that's what in Indian culture we'd call a sanskara. We can talk about just conditioning or neural pathways or whatever our vocabulary may be, of how we move through the world. If every time we come home from being out in the car, our father says to our mother, "God, you know, I can't believe that you interrupted me when I was in the middle of a sentence, and don't you realize how that makes people not respect me? And didn't you notice that, you know, Bill's wife let him finish a sentence without correcting him and interrupting him, and why can't you be more like Bill's wife?" And what do we learn? It's just our parents having an argument, but what do we learn? Well, if we're female, what we learn is be quiet. If we're male, what we learn is if you're interrupted, if something is seemingly unimportant happens in a really unimportant conversation, well, your entire self-worth is at jeopardy. Your self-worth is rooted in how your wife talks to you in public. And so we get conditioned, we get a sanskara. So that's how it happens. It then happens in school. Be quiet, speak only when spoken to. Write neatly. What are the things that are most valued in school? Your handwriting. How nicely you can make a straight line with a ruler. How much you can color in the lines. How nicely you clean up after playtime. This is the stuff we value. So what gets valued is basically how well you conform to rules. Which is fine. In order for a society to operate, there have to be some rules. But it's very, very few places in which really what's valued is looking within and knowing who you are and having the courage to share that and to be that. And so we move through our world judging ourselves based on how well we've been able to adapt to the conditioning. And different cultures are different, different families are different, different jobs are different. And this is what ends up really in many ways suffocating us, because there's no room for self. I'll give you a personal example of this. India has a lot of rules, as you may have noticed. Those of you for whom it's your first time, you may not have noticed yet. There's a lot of unspoken and some spoken cultural rules in India, particularly rules regarding women. They're not rules that are laid down in any law book, but they're cultural standards of how women should be, particularly women in a spiritual world. How you should be, how you should sit, how you should speak, what you should look like, what you should think about, what your values should be, what your priorities should be. And for me, coming from the West, particularly the progressive West, I mean California, so it's geographically and culturally about as far west as you can get in the West. It was really difficult. I remember when I first came, I'd been here a few months, we had gone on this trip to a place in Gujarat right on the ocean called Dwarka, a very, very sacred place. And it was evening time, and it had been a day full of temples and programs, and I was so excited to be back on the beach. And I said, Puja Swamiji wasn't there, but this other very renowned religious leader was there, and I said to him, I'm going to go take a walk on the beach. And he said, oh, wonderful. And he says to these two guys, you go with her. And I said, oh, no. Like, I don't want people to come with me. I'm going to go take a walk on the beach. And he said, yeah, they'll come with you. And I said, oh, no, really, I don't need them. And he said, oh, yeah, they'll come with you. Now, I was 25. I was a backpacker, a trekker, a nature person. I was someone who had spent God knows how many hours walking on trails and mountains on the beach by myself. That's, for me, how it always was supposed to be done. I mean, that was sort of the point, was you and the ocean, you and nature, you and the sunset, you and the sand. But here in India, no, you don't do that. And it wasn't that it was wrong for me to do it, it was that it was wrong for them to let me do it. Women should be taken care of, they should be protected. It would look bad from his perspective to not send at least 2 people with me to walk on the beach. And it's been a dance between what you learn with conditioning is, which aspects of it are issues or aspects that are just socialization, like the fork and the knife versus your fingers, that you say, all right, okay, here's how we do it here. Fine. Yeah, I prefer it the other way, but no problem. I'm perfectly happy, perfectly able to do this. And which aspects are important not to do? Which aspects are important to keep checking within and saying, oh wait, is this really how I feel? Or is this how I've been conditioned to believe I should feel? And that's a dance that we all have to do individually. But the answer to conditioning is not anarchy. The answer to conditioning is not, being a renegade in every area, because the problem with that is then that becomes your identity. Then that's just a different type of conditioning. Then instead of not using a fork and knife, you're not using a fork and knife. The identity goes both ways. You're still just as stuck with the fork and knifeness, whether you're using it or not. So under the guise of being free, if what I've decided is I'm going to rebel against conditioning, then that just becomes my new identity. I'm still just as stuck. So in the drive toward freedom, on the path toward freedom, which ultimately is the highest goal, that's what this is about. That's what awakening is, that's what enlightenment is it's the freedom to live in the light. The freedom to see the light without fear, without constraints, without identities. But if I simply go, we've spent a lot of time with Tommy and his group in recovery, of talking about how, from an identity perspective, you don't want to go from being an alcoholic to being was an alcoholic. Like physically, yeah, we're much better off. I'm no longer drinking or using, but my identity is still wrapped up in not drinking. On the one hand, my identity was drinking or using. Now I've stopped that. But the highest goal is not to just shift an identity from drinking and using to not drinking and using. I'm still stuck. It's just a different box. And in many cases, the highest freedom is to realize I can still be myself and use a fork and knife. I can still connect with my soul on the beach, even with two guys trailing me 10 feet behind. Even though that wasn't my first choice, even though that wasn't how I would have wanted to do it, freedom is not in saying, for God's sakes, no, don't send them. I need to be free. It's in how can I find my freedom within those rules. Because the freedom is internal. And so that's where it's really important to just keep checking in with the external conditioning. Fine, this is how our civilizations work. But internally, consciously and continuously asking ourselves, why do I think that? Why have I just passed that judgment about myself? Every time you hear yourself saying something to yourself like, oh my God, you're so stupid. Oh my God, you're worthless. Oh my God, you're never gonna get it. You're too old. You're too stupid. You're too fat. You're too poor. You're too this. You're too that. You're too not spiritual. Every time you hear yourself saying that, or anything like that, you've got to come in and say, where did I learn that? Because that is not the voice of the self. That is a conditioned voice. And the minute that we're able to step out of that and say, yeah, I remember. This would be what my mom said, or my dad said, or my teacher said, or I remember seeing a commercial that told me that once, and I internalized it. I don't have to think like that. And my highest freedom is in not thinking like that. My highest freedom is in knowing, as we were discussing last night, that who I am is full and is complete. And that's the stuff that needs to not be encroached upon. That's the conditioning that we will not accept. Is who you are is less than good enough if you don't X, Y, or Z. But it's important to have the clarity to distinguish between the two.